we're starting to make flyers. Yeah, pass those out, Derek. Yeah.
Thank you.
Started to make flyers. They help. I think they help a lot. Okay, my name is Richard, and this is the 11th? 12th. This is the 12th?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. So this is a year ago we started. Okay, good job, Cam. First of all, coffee. Over there. Free coffee. Compliments of Clifton. Big camera over there. Okay, this is the 12th LAVA Salon. This is a monthly salon. It's the last Sunday of every month up here. You probably figured that out because you're here. Today we have 3 things, but only 2 of which occurred during the 12 to 2 time frame. And the first is going to be a talk mostly by my good friend John Dullaghan. John, raise your hand. He is the filmmaker of Bukowski Born Into This. Born Into This. Born Into This.
Bukowski colon Born Into This.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Bukowski colon Born Into This. It's a great film, and he's going to mostly talk now for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then at 2, I'm going to pick up the slack, and we're going to do a walking tour of Charles Bukowski's downtown. So that'll be fun. And between that, Thessaly, the ukulele, is going to appear in about 45 minutes, Kim, she says. She'll be here, she just called. And the ukulele and the
Evil sandwiches.
Evil sandwich eaters are going to perform. So I encourage you to go run downstairs and get something to eat if you haven't done so. Don't be embarrassed. John and I are going to start to talk, and this talk is going to... John, you're basically going to... The poems are going to steer you. The poems are going to... I think the poems are going to drive this talk.
Yeah.
The Bukowski poems.
Yeah, and so everybody's... Actually, I'm not feeling too well today. I'm not going to be present for the walk, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about Bukowski's life down here in this area and sort of what he did and what he wrote about. And I've got some poems that relate to that time. And it's sort of an obscure time because not a lot of people around to talk about from the 1940s when he was down here doing his thing. But I have some information I could share.
Yeah, and the point of the walking tour is then to get back into this sort of lost world of Bohemian culture downtown, which was very real and tangible at the time. Just before we even get started, we talked about John Fante, who was Charles Bukowski's hero, one of the great LA novelists, lived downtown in the 30s. John, you were going to talk about that couple you interviewed that was that he stole their typewriter right before he left for Philadelphia, and he was talking to them about writers that were living downtown in the early 40s,
right?
That he was admired.
Yeah.
So that's really when I wrote the Bukowski tour, John was so helpful and worked with us. But when I wrote it, that's really why I wanted to write it. Is that I had written the John Fante tour, and if you write a John Fante bus tour, you really have to write the Charles Bukowski, and that was the thing that no one talks about downtown in the 40s, but it's so interesting. So I hope on the tour to get into that a lot more, and John, I know you're going to touch on that. Yeah. So, good, more people are coming. Hi, welcome aboard. Hello. It's good to see you. Hi. So, John, do you want to get so? I guess that was my introduction.
Yeah.
Go
I'll
ahead.
stand up here.
Yeah. Why don't we just we can trade off.
We can do that.
And I guess before you start, you should probably tell people what book you're reading from.
Yes.
So, a canonical document.
Can I?
You can put your stuff here.
Is this a good place to stand? I guess. Yeah. Good. Now,
Maybe if you lean against the table.
You're just going to get my silhouette, aren't you?
I am actually. How about over here?
Do you want me to move?
Yeah, that would be better. Filmmakers. They always know what they're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so odd. I think actually, John, what just happened is of historic importance. John just stood up to talk. I know you know that. But what hasn't been here, what wasn't here a month ago, what was here a month ago that is not here now, is the incredibly ugly screen behind this window. So every LAVA salon up until now has had very diffuse light, but about 2 weeks ago, this screen came down. So we just by default set up here. That's kind of wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, so is everybody familiar with Charles Bukowski? Should I go through a little? Well, just go through it just a little bit.
Just go,
okay.
yeah.
So Bukowski was, he wrote contemporaneously with the Beats, but he was not one of them. He was not one of the Beat generation. He was his own man, did his own thing. He, when I talk to people out in the general public about Bukowski, the one thing they know above and beyond everything else is Barfly. And that was the movie made with Mickey Rourke and Faye Dunaway in 1987, 88, thereabouts. And he, it's Barfly. He's just, he's in this bar, and it was based on something I'll talk about in a little bit, in a bar in Philadelphia where he was young and kind of gaining his writer's experience. But he is known, I guess there was a show at the Huntington that just closed down where they actually had his papers available, and they had a big exhibition, and they had his original chapbooks, and it was pretty neat. And Sue Hodson, who's the curator over there, she would probably describe Bukowski as the continuation of the Walt Whitman, the voice of the people talking to, the man of the people talking in the voice of the people, and taking poetry which at one time was very highly wrought and very structured, and bringing it to the voice of just the common man. Some people would say that Bukowski dragged it way down, to the voice, and he kind of took it to the ragged edge. But what's great about him is that he's so accessible, and he touches upon so many different things. And he is considered the most published, I think it's the most published poet in the 20th century, according to the little Bible. Now, I'm reading a few poems from this. This is Charles Bukowski, Pleasures of the Damned. It's sort of his greatest hits. And there are a lot of...
This just came out a couple years back.
Yeah, right. And Bukowski's funny because, you read... I did this film, I guess it's been 5-6 years ago now, and then I don't really read much Bukowski these days, but every now and then something like this comes along, and I'll pick up a book, and I'm always surprised to find something fresh. Here's one that I'm
going to interrupt you just for a second. Just step back one more time before you start this. Yeah. Charles Bukowski died in
1994.
And he started writing poetry in
1955 or thereabouts.
And he was born in 1922, or 1920.
1920, right.
So so this is just,
Yeah, is there anything else? No.
So about 40, 45 years he was writing poetry.
Yeah, but what was unique about him is he started off in his 20s really wanting to hit the big time.
Living down here.
Living down here. And he wanted to... back in the 40s, if you were a major writer, Hemingway was on the cover of Time and Newsweek. Robinson Jeffers, a poet that nobody now knows, he was on the cover of Time. So writers really, it was a different kind of thing. Now I guess it's screenwriters or something, but they're caught up in the machine. So but if you were a writer like a Hemingway, you were the thing, and that's really what he wanted to be. But he wasn't able to hit it. He wasn't able to get into Harper's and Atlantic and those magazines at the time. And it wasn't until really the 70s till he started to get any kind of renown. So he was 50 years old, 50, 60 years old at that time. So it took him a while, and as a result, his writing has a maturity to it that, a lot of younger people really like his work. Here's one that I just ran across that I thought was kind of fun. It's called Liberated Woman and Liberated Man. Look there, that one you considered killing yourself for. You saw her the other day, getting out of her car in the Safeway parking lot. She was wearing a torn green dress and old dirty boots, her face raw with living. She saw you as you walked over and spoke and then listened. Her hair did not glisten. Her eyes and her conversation were dull. Where was she? Where had she gone? The one you were going to kill yourself for. The conversation finished. She walked into the store and you looked at her automobile, and even that, which used to drive up and park in front of your door with such verve and in a spirit of adventure, now looked like a junkyard joke. You decide to shop at Safeway. You'll drive 6 blocks and buy what you need at Ralph's. Getting into your car, you were quite pleased that you didn't kill yourself. Everything is delightful and the air is clear. Your hands on the wheel, you grin as you check for traffic in the rearview mirror. My man, you think, you've saved yourself for somebody else. But who? A slim young creature walks by in a mini skirt and sandals, showing a marvelous leg. She's going to go shop in the store now. You turn off the engine and follow her in. We never learned. But that's kind of Bukowski. You know, he started off writing short stories, and then in the 50s when he started writing poetry, he kind of took what he learned from the short story work, and so it's a simple narrative. It's a simple narrative and simple language, but a lot of his poems are kind of story poems. You know, like that one.
You know, I maybe just a point that I found in giving the tour. Charles Bukowski sort of came out to the world at large, not Los Angeles, but the world at large, after the publication of his novel, Post Office.
Right.
And what I really, what you helped me understand was 1970 Post Office is published. He's already really established as an LA poet. At that point, and I don't think that's in everyone's consciousness so much. And I think that's something I really try to emphasize because you really showed me that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and just you know, I didn't give you a very good little bio on Bukowski, but his whole kind of what's central to his writing is working tough jobs, drinking in bars, but he did work for I guess 12 or 14 years at the U.S. Post Office, and he wrote a brilliant novel called Post Office, and it's about reading that book really is kind of what turned me on to his writing. He talks about the bureaucracy of the postal service and how they just grind you down and they squeeze everything they can out of you. They treat you, and it's sort of anybody that's worked in any kind of a job, especially a bureaucratic one or just a corporate job. You can really relate to what he's talking about. So that's kind of where I hooked into him. In terms of downtown here,
John, I think I have a question.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Could you talk about his father? I think he had a very bad relationship with his father.
Yes,
Did
yes.
that affect his poetry?
Yes. Well, he's somebody who, like, at the heart of Bukowski's poetry, some people would look at it and say, well, he was a depressive. It's very down, it's very dark, and there is definitely that element. But I think he was able to take kind of the difficulties of his life and turn it into a positive through his work. So yeah, he had a very, what we would call an abusive relationship. Now they didn't call it that then. They sort of hid it. And his father worked for the LA County Museum. And I actually, some of the people I'll tell you about here actually saw the father and met him. But the story that Bukowski always tells is that Bukowski had to mow the lawn, every Saturday, and if he missed one hair, he'd get a beating. And he got beaten 2-3 times a week, he figured, and it was, with a razor strop, so a big piece of leather, and just from when he was just teeny tiny. So, and then the mother got beaten too, and she didn't stand up for him. So, yeah, he had a tough upbringing in that way. And then when he was a teenager, he had these boils, this acne vulgaris. So, and again, it's something you read about. But in the film, I actually went to some medical schools, and I got photos of acne vulgaris, and it's really it's disfiguring. And when you're a teenager and you're all self-obsessed anyway. So he had a lot. He started out with some strikes against him. And had he been a different kind of person, he might have gone a very different route, So, but yeah, the father, he did write quick. What's interesting is he wasn't able to write about his childhood till he was in his 60s. It took him not that long to be able to kind of come to grips.
That was Ham on Rye.
Ham on Rye is the novel, yeah. And please, if you have a question, jump in. That's excellent.
The one last,
Yes.
I want to hear the poems. Why have so few of his books been filmed? I remember I had a friend, Taylor Hackford, who had the rights to Post Office, but he never got it made. And he's a powerful name. So why haven't his? You'd think his novels would make wonderful films.
Yeah, I mean, Factotum, Matt Dillon was in that a few years back, but I don't know. Women was acquired by the guy that did RoboCop. Taylor Hackford bought Post Office, hasn't done anything with it. And then there was talk that maybe Sean Penn would I don't know, want to be involved in some way.
Well, Sean Penn got aced out of Barfly.
Yes.
And they went with Babette Schroeder.
Right.
Instead of Dennis Hoffman. And
That's right.
they were
Yeah.
very upset.
Yeah. Mickey Rourke, I can tell you a little Mickey Rourke story too. But yeah, Sean Penn was originally supposed to play the lead in Barfly, but they couldn't.
He wanted it back.
Couldn't work. So
maybe just I put this at the end. Maybe if there's time in the last 5 minutes, we can talk about rarely seen Bukowski films that are not really. And Terry, do you want to talk about Susu at that point? Susan Tyrell. Susu, yeah.
Talk about
Susu's a great topic. We'll do that at the
and
end.
Ham on Rye, to your point too, has been acquired. It's for decades. I think he bought a swimming pool with the rights, but the film's never been made. So in terms of downtown, it's sort of hard to. Again, Bukowski was in his 20s. This was the 1940s. Not a lot of people around to talk about his actual life down here. I was able to access his postal files, U.S. So his postal files and his FBI files. The FBI followed him for a little bit. He had this magazine, like they did with Lenin. They found him to be a rebel, and so the government had their eye on him because of that he was in counterculture newspapers. But so between those two things, you're able to kind of piece together some of the places he worked. There was a department store called Milleron's, which I think is just a few blocks from here, where he worked. You can read about most of the things that he writes about in this area are in the book Factotum. Okay, some of it on Ham on Rye, but Factotum. There was an art store he worked at as a stock boy down on Flower Street. The LA Times building, he said that he polished the banisters in the LA Times building. That's what he claims he did. He worked in the Biltmore in Factotum. He talks about, he'd get these big crates of lobsters and he'd have to run them up the stairs and he'd fall and he was hung over. And anyway, so he worked at the Biltmore. Pershing Square he hung around a bit. The Burbank Follies you're going to show us, and Bunker Hill Richard will talk to a little later. So those are some of the places that we know that he went to. And then in terms of the bars, there's a whole big, everybody knows of a place where Bukowski drank. Anybody who talks to. And they're far and few between than you'd think. His baby mama, the mother of his child, Marina Francis, he told her, he said, I don't like to go into bars, I just don't like the people in there, it's just not good people, And he had gotten several DUIs by that point and public drunkenness raps. So he stayed inside. So he didn't go out and drink in bars as much as kind of people think. In San Pedro, again, there's a lot of myth about, he tore up the bars in San Pedro, but by that time he was married, he was older. There was a little Japanese restaurant you can go to, it's called Senfuku. He called it Senfuku. Sorry. But he would go there and order his sushi and have a beer, but very, very mellow towards the end of his life. And then Clifton's here. He would come. In fact, I have a poem about him that I'll read to you. But he came here in his early 20s. It was one of the places we could come and get a cheap meal. And then later in his life, he would come with Linda, and they'd look at the waterfall downstairs. Let me see here. Here's a poem. Here's a poem. So what happened? He moved. He was. He graduated from high school and he wanted to become a writer, so he moved down here. And here's a story about his mother finding him in a rooming house nearby.
This would be on Bunker Hill.
I guess it would be on. It's called On Being 20. So this would have been 1940. My mother knocked on my rooming house door and came in. Looked in the dresser drawer. Henry, you don't have any clean stockings. Do you change your underwear? Mom, I don't want you poking around in here. The mother continues, I hear that there's a woman who comes into your room late at night and she drinks with you. She lives right down the hall. She's all right. Henry, you can get a terrible disease. Yeah. I talked with your landlady. She's a nice lady. She says you must read a lot of books in bed because as you fall asleep at night, the books fall to the floor. They can hear it all over the house. Heavy books. One at midnight, another at 1 a.m., another at 2 a.m., another at 4. After she left, I took the library books back, returned to the rooming house, and put the dirty stockings and the dirty underwear and the dirty shirts into the paper suitcase. Took the streetcar downtown, boarded the Trailways bus to New Orleans, figuring to arrive with $10 and let them do with me what they would, and they did.
They did.
They did indeed. So, one really lucky thing was they had this show at the Huntington, and it was the Bukowski Archive. But I actually, when I was starting to work on the film, I helped Linda kind of start to get that archive together. And we went out into the garage, and he would write, and he'd throw pages into a box that had held wine bottles. And in the garage, there were all these boxes of manuscripts and letters, and it was really a treasure trove of stuff. And I was kind of the first outsider to lay my eyes on this stuff. In there were all kinds of letters, but in there was a letter from a couple saying, Hank, I guess it was about 87, Hank, we just saw you in Time Magazine, and it's been 30 years, and it looks like you've done great, and you were awarded Poet of the Year or something. And it had their name, Robert and Beverly Knox, in Paradise, California. Well, I contacted them, and Robert and Beverly Knox actually knew Bukowski when he lived down here during the 40s at that time. And here's what they told me. And unfortunately, he died I made initial contact and talked with him, and then he passed away. But I was able to visit her. She lived up in Idaho, and I did a long interview with her. And she, now mind you, this was just kind of this is the time when Bukowski's writing about kind of going to the bars and, writing and knocking around and fist fights and all that stuff. And she remembers that she said, Hank, he was just good old Hank to us. He was just a wonderful guy. He was quiet. He didn't really say too much. And there were three friends. Her name was Beverly, then her husband, Robert, and they had a little baby. I don't know his name. And then there was Bob Baum, who was, so Bukowski and Bob Baum and her husband Robert were all in the same journalism class together. And everybody in that group thought that Robert Baum would be the writer. He just seemed to have the talent, before Bukowski just couldn't get it going. But they were all friends, and I think they were kind of a surrogate family for him. I really do, because he didn't have much going on, much support at home, but he had this group of friends at LA City College where they were going to school. She told me a few interesting stories. One was that they were all hanging out, just kind of having fun, and it all seemed very innocent. Now, when he writes about it in Ham on Rye, everybody's drunk, and the baby's drinking liquor out of a bottle, and things are flying through the air, but she didn't remember it that way at all. But she said that he was sitting there, Hank was sitting there, and I jumped on his lap, and I hugged him, and I said, Hank, and she said he pulled back. And she said that what she got out of that was that he didn't have any contact with women. He was like afraid of a woman sitting in his lap. And she said also that he just had the pockmarked face. She said she could see it up close, and it was really disturbing. She said that they went over to the parents' house, met Mr. and Mrs. Bukowski.
Were they living in Temple City at the time?
I think this was on Longwood Avenue.
Still in West Avenue.
Yeah. And that the father was just really not a nice guy. Just didn't want them to be there, and just sort of. He seemed to be who he was. Now, I'll just tell you a little aside here. Bukowski had an uncanny ability to capture somebody on the page. I believe what he writes about his father. I met people 30, 40 years down the road, and Bukowski's description of them is just pinpoint. He would take certain things and exaggerate them, but I mean, you can really get the sense of the person. He was really, really amazing in that way. But they backed up Bukowski's story about the father just kind of being, stern, and the mother. So that they were all there. The Robert Knox, his wife, the baby, and Bukowski's mother was saying, "Oh, Hank, look at the baby. Don't you want it? Maybe you should have a baby. It'd be great to be a grandparent. Look at the And then Bukowski was just like, oh God. And they remembered that, and they remembered him telling the story of the cutting the grass. And they knew just by getting to know him, they knew that he'd had kind of a pretty rough upbringing. But here's a poem I found. I was just flipping through this book, and I happened to find this poem that talks about that whole time. And this is, just getting out of the house and being a bunker. It's called Self-Inflicted Wounds. He talked about Steinbeck and Thomas Wolfe, and he wrote like a cross between the two of them. And I lived in a hotel on Figueroa Street, close to the bars. And he lived further uptown in a small room, and we both wanted to be writers. And we'd meet at the public library, sit on the stone benches, and talk about that. He showed me his short stories, and he wrote well. He wrote better than I did. There was a calm and a strength in his work that mine did not have. My stories were jagged and harsh, with self-inflicted wounds. I showed him all of my work, but he was more impressed with my drinking prowess and my worldly attitude. After talking a bit, we would go to Clifton's cafeteria for our only meal of the day for less than $1 in 1941. Yet, we were in great health. We lost our jobs, found jobs, lost jobs. Mostly we didn't work. We always envisioned we soon would be receiving regular checks from the New Yorker, the Atlantic Monthly, and Harper's. We ran with a gang of young men who didn't envision anything at all, but they had a gallant, lawless charm, and we drank with them and fought with them and had a hell of a wild good time. Then, just like that, he joined the Marine Corps. I want to prove something to myself, was what he told me. He did. Right after boot camp, the war came, and in 3 months he was dead. And I promised myself that someday I would write a novel and that I would dedicate it to him. I now have written 5 novels, all dedicated to others. You know, you were right, Robert Baum, when you once told me, Bukowski, about half of what you say is bullshit. So the final other story that Beverly Knox told me was that her husband and Bukowski she'd gone to bed and they were up drinking one night, and she woke up and her husband was hungover, and she walked into the bathroom and there was wine throw up all over the walls and the floor and the shower and everything. She said it was a disaster. And she said, but to top it all off, our typewriter was missing. And that Hank had left for Philadelphia. So she saw him, that was his last exit before he went to Philadelphia, which of course is where all the famous Barfly material comes from. And the Barfly material actually, when he wrote that script, it was a combination of two things. It was going back to his years in Philadelphia here, and then he came back to LA and he met a woman named Jane, and they were drinking partners, and so he kind of combined those two eras into one. And that time in his life, in the 80s, after he'd moved to San Pedro, things had slowed down a bit. He'd sit up on his typewriter, later his computer, and not a lot was going on, but he would go back to those times and really mine them, And that's the era where he wrote Barfly. And some people criticize his writing during that time. They say, well, it's just kind of, there are 1,001 poems of, I'm up here at the typewriter. It's been good to me. It's been a good run. John Martin saved me when nobody else would. I look out at the harbor, and and the miracle continues. It's like that. He wrote a lot of poems, and people look at it and they say, "Oh God, not another sitting up in my room writing a poem." But so he did go back, and if you look at one of the big shifts in his writing is he had TB back in I think it was '89, and he couldn't drink for a year. So depression set in, and he was having it, and he writes the septuagenarian stew, and it's just the poems now, as opposed to being like kind of these stories, they're just whittled down to the essence. They're almost like haikus, and he goes back into his childhood and revisits a lot of this stuff, and it's brilliant stuff. And then you read The Last Night of the Earth poems, which is just one of my favorites, and it's
that was the last published book of poetry of his while he was alive.
And he's at the end of his life, and it's just sort of like that perspective of being on the mountaintop, and just kind of having that distance. Just beautiful, beautiful poems. But of course, then he died, and he'd written a number of poems about death, which nobody had seen until later. And there are a couple of them. And I think he really, anybody that wanted to criticize him for whatever he wrote in the 80s, but then towards the end, he just gets this blast of creativity. And I'll read a few of these to you. Blue fish, the blue night, blue knife. Everything is blue, and my cats are blue. Blue fur, blue claws, blue whiskers, blue eyes. My bed lamp shines blue. Oh goodness. Inside my blue heart pumps blue blood. My fingernails, my toenails are blue. And around my bed floats a blue ghost. Even the taste inside my mouth is blue, and I am alone and dying and blue. Here's another one, like a dolphin. Dying has its rough edge, no escaping now. Warden has his eye on me, his bad eye. I'm doing hard time now, in solitary, locked down. I'm not the first nor the last, I'm just telling you how it is. I sit in my own shadow now. The face of the people grows dim. The old songs will play, hand on my chin. I dream of nothing while my lost childhood leaps like a dolphin in the frozen sea. So, yeah, he was something. So that's basically all I had to
Hey,
say.
John, I have a question or two. First of all, could you please confirm for everyone that you and Linda did approach Apple, that they should do an ad about Bukowski?
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I didn't really go
Macintosh.
anywhere. I was working in the ad agency. I was writing Apple Computers advertising at the time, and they had the Think Different campaign. And Linda said, well, Hank should be up there on the billboard. And so I talked to the account executive, and we said all this stuff, these photos, and they didn't bite. So. But it really did. The computer changed his writing. I said it quadrupled his output. I mean, he was really prolific anyhow, but he got on that computer and it was just like, stacks and stacks.
But don't you think that the reason that he resonated after his death and things and almost had a resurgence was, to me, he always seemed like sort of that Ayn Rand sort of prototype of the individual, versus thrown into the post office department and things like that. Even literarily, he wasn't a joiner. And I also think that this, much like Tennessee Williams or Truman Capote, who had these unendurable childhoods that kind of created the pressure, that turned him in coal to a diamond. And every time I would read his things, it seemed like I had a lot of friends that are artists and things, and these bad things happen to them, but they have, like in the cartoons, they have almost like an invisible zipper that they can slip into. And I always thought his writing was more for himself, and that this is literally how he could take these horrible experiences, filter them through his own Play-Doh, and come up with these little, and then literally put them away and walk away.
Yes, I think that writing for him was therapeutic, and writing for him was he wasn't a social person per se, but he wrote tons and tons and tons of letters, and that was his way of kind of communicating. I wonder, how if Bukowski would be a Facebooker or not, or I don't know, email, but he wrote so there are volumes of his letters, and I think that writing was therapeutic for him, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
When you read the poems, they sound like prose. I mean, they're extremely agreeable, listenable, but I can't see the difference between the prose and the poems when you read them out. Maybe on the page they look. Do they actually scan and that?
Yeah, they do. Yeah,
I see. No, I'm not putting them down. They sound like prose.
Yeah.
I see.
I really like his. For me personally, I was always drawn to his poetry. The kind of the dirty old man stuff. That's not my favorite. There's a family sitting. That kind of edgy stuff. But yeah, the poetry to me. There's one poem that he writes. It's called Art, and it's when the spirit wanes, the form appears. And that's a kind of a heavy thought. When we get weaker spiritually, we look outside ourselves for the girl or the car or the job, but when we're stronger inside, that stuff becomes less important. So, there's a wisdom, there's kind of a life wisdom that I was drawn to in his work.
Did he write screenplays? I'm sorry.
Just Barfly.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. He actually,
Yeah.
Would you happen to know if any musicians were ever inspired by him? Only because in listening to his upbringing and some of the poetry, there seems to be some Dylan-esque or Springsteen undertones to some of the stuff that he's written.
I don't, Dylan, I don't know. I saw, X.
Yes.
X was influenced by him. Bono, one of the, if you look on Amazon, my film people liked it pretty much overall, but the one thing I kept getting knocked for again and again is, why did you put Bono in there? Haven't we seen enough Bono? And I thought, what I tried to show throughout the film was people who are kind of struggling artists, and then people who've made it, who've been influenced by him. And U2 definitely was. And people like Sean Penn also, So musically, Modest Mouse there's a song that they've got where they reference Bukowski as well. So.
I think the Wikipedia page for Charles Bukowski, at one of the final sections, there's a list of bands that have been influenced by him. It's pretty exhaustive.
Yeah,
it's a pretty exhaustive list. John, I was wondering. So I love the poetry riff. I'm wondering if you could step back from septuagenarians too and go back to 62, 63, Richard Quarrington, Bukowski in mid-flight, the crucifix in the hand, crucifix in a death hand, and just Bukowski as a poet and the reaction of American poets in the mid-60s to what really people were thinking was pretty cutting-edge stuff.
What happened? The story was that he was working in the post office, and it was really tough for him, drinking a lot, and he's with Jane, and they were drinking buddies, and they the bad habits of one, accelerate the bad habits in the other, and he actually, he was sitting there one day, and he started throwing up blood, and blood came out both ends, and they took him to the emergency room down at USC, and the doctor said, if you have another drink, it's going to kill you. Don't do it. So he got out of it. The story is he got out of there, but then of course he continued. But what's interesting is after that was a life-changing moment for him. He almost died, and he realized that now is the time. I got to do. If I'm going to be a writer, if I'm going to do something with my life, this is the time. And he started writing. You can't believe the prolific. Just poem after poem after poem. And now they were getting published. Some little switch went off, and so he became like the most published person in these small chapbooks, and he started to get really well known, and critics started to notice him. And his writing earlier on, his writing is more poetic, if you will. There's more symbolism and metaphor, and he never was a rhymer, but it's more. You could say self-conscious, but it's more highly wrought, than his later stuff, which just, yes, you're right, it just flows just like he's like a conversation.
By the way, he's very big in England, among the young. A good friend of mine in England, who's a writer himself, his daughters adore him, and they're very upper-class British in London, and they just love him. Charles Bukowski is fabulous, and so he's actually very big in England. Among that sort of, those people, rich people, that's interesting.
Wow.
He'd be happy.
Yeah, he really does. His demographic or whatever is completely wide and really hard to pin down. People from every. But I think the common thread is if you've kind of felt the knife going in, if you've suffered and I don't know, or had alcoholic parents, had a drinking problem yourself, all of these things that he went through. If you've dealt with it, you can relate to him, and so he taps into a lot of just human experience.
John, I think we're running out of time. I want to just wrap this up. I don't want to have time for questions, but why don't we?
This is our next Triple T album.
Are there any more questions?
Are you working on another film, documentary?
I'm not. I start off in the ad agencies, and I did this film, and then I went back to the ad agencies just as if it had never happened. Although every now and then a young person will come in, 20-year-old, and they'll say, "Oh, you did Bukowski, can you sign my DVD?" And I'll sign, and then it's just back to life. And then Richard pulls me out of the closet every now and again, and I talk about it. That's it. Yeah, no,
But
it's,
life is good for you, John.
well,
Life
things are good. I'm surviving, you know. But I found that, you know, I got to kind of figure out the economics of documentaries a little better next time if I do one, because it's kind of tough. Yeah. One more question, or that's it?
That's it. All
Thank
right,
you very much.
Oh, Terry, go ahead.
I
Terry.
have, it must have been thrilling to sort of seek these people out and actually, it must have made it all worthwhile when you're actually in their living room
Yeah.
telling you these stories and you're comparing them to what you know already. It must have been great, like living a detective story.
It was like a detective story, and the big question I had is because Bukowski's writing is autobiographical, and so much of it, there's something about when you read these stories, it's like they are wild, they're completely crazy, but there's an authenticity to them. It's like you know that this just sounds real. I mean, there were stories I heard about him that there's one where he's at a party and some guy pulls out a gun and says, you know, you're against the war, I'm gonna. And Bukowski walks up to the guy and he puts his gut, and he said, go ahead and pull the trigger, man. I don't think you've got the guts. And the guy breaks down and cries. Bukowski, take it. But I know several people that wear, you know, it sounds like a Bukowski story, but, and there were all kinds of, I mean, Linda tells the stories about how, you know, they were in France and he pulled out a knife and threatened a guard, and then they came after, you know, it was just, you know, he was just one of these, I get the sense, you know, he's just one of these bigger than life characters that kind of attracted drama and created it, and but yeah, so you wonder what was the truth, what wasn't, and I found out that there was a lot of truth in, he didn't exaggerate things, but there was a lot of truth to what he wrote, so surprisingly.
Anyone who's taken Richard's tour on Black Dahlia, I was shocked because, you know, Elizabeth Short was the definition of a nobody. And it's amazing how much you can find out about just an average person. I mean, the gynecologist, all it's amazing. So, you know, with a person of letters and notes, it must be even more so. There's things that you can find out about a person.
Oh yeah.
After they're gone, it's absolutely
Well, and what I found out,
scary.
talking about the father, I actually went to Germany. I mean, I was obsessed, you know. And I figured that if I'm going to do this, I'm going to record as much information as I can to record the guy's life. Whether it goes in the film or not, I've got it as an archive. And what I found out was in World War II, when the parents met, you know, I mean, the economy in Germany in World War I, actually, you know, of course, it was just you know, not as bad as it could be. And so the young women there were running off with the American GIs. So did she love them? I don't know. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But she needed a way out of there in any event. And so when she came back over here, so she didn't speak the language. You know, she was kind of trapped in this prison. And here he's beating her, but it sheds a different light on kind of what that relationship was. And here's the kid in the middle of it, and he wasn't planned. And the father used to call him a bastard. And, I mean, you know, it was bad. See, you're not going to make those mistakes with you got a baby Bjorn going, and he's happy.
All right, we're gonna let you ask the question, but definitely you and the evil sandwiches should come on up and get ready, and we're gonna let you ask the question.
The last question. What were his last days, last weeks like? Where did he die? And
Yes.
did he leave a big estate? Where did it go?
Where's he buried?
He contracted leukemia March 9th. Yeah, March 9th, 1993, and he was dead literally a year later. And yeah, he was just fighting that, and it's god awful. It's god awful. He was spent a lot of time in that hospital. He writes about it, and I don't know. He died of cancer, and it's just it was hard. It really tore my heart out to hear those stories. You know.
Where is he buried?
He's up in Green Hills Cemetery in San Pedro, off of Western Avenue. And the estate, you know, I mean, like, if you're an artist, you die and you do better after you're dead. But for a poet, he had a remarkably successful career.
Did the Huntington buy his estate, or did his wife give it?
Linda donated it to them,
Donated.
but it was quite a leap for them to accept it and to promote it. you know.
sometimes they buy. In Isherwood's case, they bought. I mean, they paid
They
a
did, really?
tremendous amount of money.
Well, they tell me that they don't. Yeah, I don't know. Well,
Yeah,
but I think
so they didn't buy Bukowski.
they didn't.
They
But I
also
think
done.
their tax breaks, so it kind of works
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
They've got the money.
Hi.
All right, well, listen, I want everyone to thank John. John, thank you. And if you're planning on if you're signed up for the walking tour, we'll get that started at about 5 minutes to 2. We'll go. I'll announce it. We'll go downstairs and get the waiver signed, and maybe you'll walk with us just for a couple minutes. Maybe just for a walk.
If the coffee works.
Okay, for a walker. All right. Thank you so much. We are now going to move on to my good friend, Thessaly Lerner, the ukulady.
Good morning!